Hey there friends, it's Laurie. I'm so happy you stopped by because today I'm sharing 6 of my favorite winter and Christmas wreaths. Most are neutral with a farmhouse vibe, but they all work perfect for the holidays. To keep the cost down, I did use mostly Dollar Tree supplies, and as always, I hope you have fun crafting with me, so let's get busy. Getting started, I'm using an 18-inch fir greenery wreath that I picked up at Michael's. I picked it up in their after Christmas clearance and I paid $2.39. To give my wreath a snowy accent, I'm using some white acrylic paint. Using a paintbrush, I'm adding it on here and there, and I'm not being super fussy or particular, and you can pretty much add on as much or as little as you'd like. I continued working my way around the wreath until most of the green was covered. Now that my wreath is dry, I'm adding on 2 sets of 3 hanging snowflakes from the Dollar Tree. They're attached by little plastic loops, and I'm just cutting them free from each other. I'm attaching all 6 to the wreath, but before I do, I first like to find their placement. As I was adding them, I made sure that none of the snowflake points were sticking into the center of the wreath, and this way I had a nice flat edge. Now that I have them all in place, I'm using my hot glue gun to permanently attach them. Be sure to use a generous amount because you'll be layering a second snowflake on top of each of these. I'm adding some ribbons in between the snowflakes, and I'm using a 2.5-inch wired white ribbon with silver accents, and I did have this on hand. Along with my white ribbon, I'm adding a 2.5-inch wired neutral snowflake ribbon, and I picked this up at Michael's. I'm adding in a silver sparkle ribbon from the Dollar Tree, and this is also 2.5 inches and wired. I'll be adding on 6 clusters, so I'm cutting 6 ribbons from each spool at 10 inches each. I'm making my snowflake wreath in more of the neutral tones, but you can always change up the ribbons and add in some pops of color. I have all of my ribbons cut, and now I'm going to dovetail the ends, which is super easy. I just fold the end of the ribbon in half and then cut away at an angle. I'm attaching my ribbon clusters together using some floral wire, but if you don't have any of this on hand, you can always use a pipe cleaner or a chenille stem. I'm making 3 of my ribbon clusters with the white on the top, the snowflake in the center, and the silver on the bottom. I fold my ribbons in half to make sure the ends are even, give it a little pinch in the center. I then wrap the floral wire around it, pulling it down tightly and twisting it in the back. With 3 of those complete, I'm now making my next 3. And this time, I'm going to place the snowflake ribbon on the top, the white in the center, and once again, the silver on the bottom. I'm now following the same instructions, folding my ribbons in half so that I have even ends, giving it a little pinch in the middle, and adding on the floral wire and twisting it tightly in the back. I now have all 6 complete, and I'm adding them onto the wreath. I'm attaching the white ribbons on top first, and I'm adding them on every other snowflake. I'm wrapping the 2 wires around the wreath form in between each of the snowflakes and then twisting them tightly together on the back. After securing them in place, I do have a little bit of extra wire, but instead of snipping it off, I'm just folding it over and pressing it against the back of the wreath. With those 3 in place, I'm now attaching the ribbon clusters with the snowflakes on top. I like using the green floral wire because as you're wrapping it around, it's hidden within the wreath. If you're using a chenille stem, try to find one that's a similar color, but if you don't have one on hand, you can always paint it. With all my ribbons attached tightly to the wreath, I'm now working my way around and I'm fluffing them out. As I was fluffing out the ribbons, I curled over the ends just a tiny bit. As an accent in between each of my ribbons, I'm using 6 of the silver snowflake scatters from the Dollar Tree. I used my glue gun and attached one in between each of the ribbon clusters. I found 6 of these really pretty white snowflake ornaments at the Dollar Tree. They also sell a silver version and a really pretty sparkly blue. You could add those on as well. Because they're ornaments, they have a little hanger hole, and all I did was use my clippers and I clipped it off at an angle so it looked like it was part of the snowflake. I did this to all 6, and now I'm adding them onto my wreath. I'm adding hot glue onto the top of each snowflake and then pressing down my snowflake ornament. I think this was one of the easiest wreaths I've ever made, and it was super inexpensive to make as well. I love that this is a neutral piece of farmhouse decor, and I think it would look great hanging in everyone's home. With everything in place, my winter snowflake wreath is ready to hang. I'm just popping in to ask, if you're new to my channel, please consider clicking on that little red subscribe button below and leaving me a thumbs up. And to all my returning friends, you know I am always so happy to see you, and I love reading everyone's comments. To start my farmhouse Christmas wreath, I'm using one of the 14-inch wire wreath forms from the Dollar Tree. I'm also using from the kitchen department at the Dollar Tree 3 flour sack towels. I'm starting by using one and I'm opening it up, and it's a really big piece of fabric. Before I start cutting it into strips, I'm removing the finished edges. The strips will have a slight fray, and if I leave the finished edges, you might see them on the wreath. I opened my fabric up, and honestly, one thing I loved about making this wreath is you don't have to be perfect. I cut out 9-inch strips, and they were about an inch wide. Some ended up being a little wider, some a little thinner, but I did make sure that they all ended up at 9 inches in length. Oh, and some of my edges, they weren't perfect either. I'm adding my first strip around the outside 2 wires. I'm making sure that the ends match up, and then I'm just tying the fabric into a knot. I made sure it was pushed up tightly against the support, and now I'm adding on my second piece. I wrapped it around the 2 inside wires, and once again I made sure the ends matched up, and then I just tied it into a knot. I'm adding on my third, wrapping it around the 2 middle wires, making sure the ends match up, and then tying it into a knot. I keep adding the strips of cloth, making sure to push them tightly together, and I continued doing this until I filled out the section. I'm adding on some simple ribbon accents, and I'm using a 1 1/2 inch buffalo check ribbon. This I picked up at Michael's. If you have the 2 1/2 inch that's sold at Dollar Tree, that will work just as well. In addition to the buffalo check ribbon, I'm using a 2-inch burlap ribbon from the Dollar Tree. I'm cutting 8 9-inch pieces of the buffalo check ribbon. And I'm cutting 14 pieces of the 2-inch burlap ribbon. I'm using 6 pieces of the buffalo check and 12 of the burlap ribbon on my wreath. The other 5 pieces, they'll become my bow. I'm adding 1 piece of buffalo check and 2 pieces of burlap onto my wreath. Just like the strips of fabric, I'm wrapping each piece of burlap, one on the outside and one on the inside. But instead of tying them on with a knot, I'm just tying them on with one tie. I then added on my buffalo check ribbon around the 2 middle wires, and then pushed all 3 tightly against the fabric. With those in place, I then continued on adding my strips of fabric. My next section is complete, so I'm adding on the 2 pieces of burlap and my buffalo check ribbon. I continued following the same pattern around the form, adding the ribbon at every section until my wreath was complete. Now that I'm done, I'm working my way around the wreath and I'm fluffing out the ribbons. If I find anything that's a bit overly frayed, I'm just snipping it off with my scissors. I found this cute Be Merry sign at the Dollar Tree, and I'm removing the hanger and the red bow. I found its placement in the center of my wreath, and then I just hot glued it into place. Mine attached without a problem, but if you need more support, just run a small piece of wood across the back. I'm making a really simple bow for my wreath, and I'm using 3 pieces of the buffalo check ribbon and 2 of the burlap. I'll be attaching them together with a piece of floral wire. I started with the buffalo check and then alternated the ribbons. I folded them in half to find my center and then wrapped the piece of floral wire around it and twisted it tightly on the back. I fluffed out the ribbons and then snipped off the excess wire. To finish up, I placed hot glue over the greenery on my sign and attached the bow. And now this pretty farmhouse wreath is ready for the holidays. Getting started, I'm using this Santa Claus sign from the Dollar Tree. If you can't find this one, you can use any of their Santa face signs. Or you can make your own. I've made a couple in past videos, and I'll link those below. The face on this Santa is kind of off-white, so I'm going to brighten it up with my white acrylic paint, and you're pretty much not going to see any of it, but just in case something peeks through, it'll have a nice white background. For my Santa's beard and mustache, I'm using one of the mop heads from the Dollar Tree. There are 2 clips on the top that hold it all together, and I just snipped those off with my pliers, and now I have full long strands. I'm using all of them, but I am holding 5 aside to make Santa's mustache. I'm using a white chenille stem or pipe cleaner to hold them all together. And the best part is, if you don't have a white one, you can just paint it. I'm adding a line of hot glue through the center of the mop strands. I'm then placing my chenille stem down into the glue. I'm adding a line of hot glue over the chenille stem and then folding over my mop strands. I now have all my strands wrapped tightly around the chenille stem. I'm pushing them in a bit from each side to make sure the strands are matched up tightly together. To attach Santa's beard, I'm adding some hot glue onto the front of his face. I'm running it down both sides from the hat and onto his mustache. I'm placing down the 2 ends and pushing the beard up under Santa's nose. I'm then lifting the beard, adding on some more hot glue to help attach it to the sign. Santa's beard seems just a bit long to me, so I'm going to trim it up. I worked back and forth with my scissors until it was the length that I wanted, and I trimmed off just a little bit at a time. To make Santa's mustache, I matched up the 5 ends of the mop strands, and then I folded them in half. I'm using a half-white chenille stem to attach my mustache together, and I'm pinching it in the center. I wrapped the chenille stem around the middle, pulled it tightly, and twisted it on the back. I then used my scissors to cut open the loops and away the excess chenille stem. And just like the beard, I gave it a little trim. I'm attaching it with my glue gun onto his face just above the beard. To make Santa's nose, I'm using a round wooden knob, and I did have this on hand. I'm giving it a coat of my peachy acrylic paint. Now that it's dry, I'm using my glue gun and attaching it into the center of Santa's mustache. I'm giving him the classic Santa hat, and I'm using one from the Dollar Tree. I'm filling mine up just a bit, and I'm using a handful of polyfill. You can always buy one of those small pillows at the Dollar Tree, cut it open, and use that. I tucked it in the hat and then slid Santa's head inside underneath the polyfill. I used my glue gun and I attached the new hat onto the original Santa hat. I pushed Santa's beard out of the way and then I slightly angled the hat on both sides. To trim out Santa's hat, I'm using one of the white dusting pads from the Dollar Tree. I'm cutting it in half and I'm using my fingers on the underside to pull away the fluff, and then I'm cutting it right down the center. With my two pieces cut, I'm now adding them onto his hat. I'm adding some hot glue to the original white on Santa's hat and then placing down the pad. I then turned it around and attached the pad to the top part of the hat. I then attached the two short ends onto the back. I'm adding the second pad to the two sides of the hat. I placed the finish edge on one side and then basically cut the pad in half. I then hot glued both of the pieces, one to each side. You can always cut off the excess. I decided to glue mine onto the back. With everything in place, I folded over the top of Santa's hat and I attached the pom-pom to the front. I'm giving my Santa a little mouth and I'm using one of the red sparkly vase fillers from the Dollar Tree. You can pretty much use anything small and round, or you can just completely skip this step. I parted his beard and added some hot glue just under his mustache and attached his mouth. To make the sign, I'm using one of the hanging wood decor pieces from the Dollar Tree, and it measures 4.5 by 18 inches. I removed the hanger and I'm painting the front side with my white acrylic paint. Now that it's dry, I want to tone down the white just a bit, and I'm going to use a pencil. Along the outside edge, I'm using my pencil and I'm making a messy sketch. I'm rubbing the pencil back and forth as I go, and then I'm rubbing it in and kind of smudging it with my fingers. As I'm doing this, it not only leaves a smoky accent, but brings out some of the grains in the wood. And I only did 3 sides because the end with the holes, well, that will be hidden under Santa. When I was done with the edges, I then made some random lines here and there. Rubbed them in with my fingers, and when I was done, the board had a vintage vibe to it. I'm adding on the words Merry Christmas, and I found these wooden cutouts at Michael's for $2.99. I painted my Merry with red acrylic paint and my Christmas with sage green. I'm adding both onto my wooden sign using some E6000. Because the letters are so thin, I'm using the end of a wooden skewer, placing on some glue and then adding it to the back of my words. With the glue added to the back of my Merry Christmas, I then added the words to the right side of my sign. With that complete, I'm going to seal it with a coat of my matte Mod Podge. A little bit of the E6000 snuck out from under the letters and it left a little bit of a gloss, so this was the perfect way to hide it. For my base, I'm using one of the 18-inch wire wreath forms from the Dollar Tree. To wrap it, I'm using 3 of the red Santa scarves, and these came from the Dollar Tree as well. There's a big white pom-pom and a bell on each end, and there's a little thread that holds them together. I just snipped that and they fell right off. I'm definitely hanging on to the poms and the bells so I can craft with them in the future. I'm attaching the scarves to the form, and I'm starting on the back. I added a bit of hot glue and attached one end. From there, I continued adding hot glue to the form and then just wrapping the scarf around it. While I was adding it, I did keep the fabric as flat as possible so that I had a nice even edge. When I came to the end of the scarf, I made sure that that piece was on the bottom of the form. To add the next scarf, I just started on the back and worked my way around. If you can't find these at the Dollar Tree, you can always use a different style scarf or even use some red fabric. When I came to the end of adding on my last scarf, there was a little bit of fabric left over, so I just snipped that off and hot glued the end on the back. I'm adding my Merry Christmas and Santa sign, and I first want to find their placement on the form. When I was done, I removed Santa and I'm using some hot glue to attach the sign. I'm first adding on one package of the wired garland ties from the Dollar Tree. They come 12 to a package, so I'm adding 6 on the top and 6 on the bottom. I double checked that they would be hidden under my Santa, and then I hot glued all 12 in place. The next layer that I'm adding to my wreath are 2 stems of snow greenery from the Dollar Tree. I snipped all of the stems free from the main branch. I placed the greenery on my wreath, adding even numbers to the top and the bottom. Happy with their placement, I then attached them to the form with my glue gun. For my next layer, I'm adding on 2 bunches of the Dollar Tree snowberries, and just like my other greenery, I cut them all free from the main stem. I tucked these in between my other 2 layers, and I added the same amount on the bottom and the top. To make sure they don't move out of place, I once again used my hot glue gun to attach them. The best part of finding their placement before you permanently attach them is if you're not happy, you can always just move them around. For my final accent, I'm using 2 bunches of the Dollar Tree's winter willows. Once again, I clipped them all free from the main stem, and I added equal amounts on the top and the bottom. I tucked them in between the layers on the bottom and the top, so my wreath looks like it has a touch of snow. And of course, I used my glue gun to make sure that nothing moved out of place. Now that I'm done, I gave both ends a little fluffing, and now I'm ready to add on Santa's face. To be sure that Santa's face stays in place, I'm using 2 pieces of floral wire. I added some hot glue onto the back of Santa's head, folded my wire in half, and then placed it into the glue. I then cut a small opening in the back of Santa's hat, added in some hot glue, folded my wire, and placed that in as well. Along with the wires, I'm using my Gorilla Hot glue sticks to attach them to the wreath. I placed the 2 wires around the wreath form and then twisted them together tightly on the back. I clipped off the excess wire and then used my Gorilla Glue to help Santa attach to the wreath. For the final accent on my Christmas wreath, I'm using some of the Dollar Tree holly. I cut off 2 of the sprigs, and they come with 3 leaves, but I only wanted 2, so I removed a leaf from each. I attached one in the corner of my Merry Christmas sign, and the other I attached onto Santa's hat. And with that, my Santa wreath is ready for a Merry Christmas. I'm starting by using an 18-inch white grapevine wreath. It was originally $29.99, but I found it on the clearance rack at Michael's for $6. I'm using 1 package of the Dollar Tree's green garland. Starting at one end, I wrapped it around my wreath and I stopped, leaving myself about 6 or 8 inches of open space. After I snipped it off, I started again and did it 3 more times. As you're cutting it, don't worry if it's not matching up perfect, because once it's glued on, you won't even notice. When I was done, I did have a little piece left over, and I'm just going to hang on to that for another project. With all of them cut, I placed down my first piece and then hot glued it into place. I then added on my second piece, and I'm basically trying to cover the grapevine wreath. I get asked what kind of hot glue do I use, and I use the Gorilla Hot glue sticks. Sometimes I'll get stuck using the generic if I run out, but pretty much once you glue something in place with the Gorilla Hot glue, it's not going to move. With the third one attached, I then finished up and added on my fourth. Now that I have it all attached, the greenery, it's kind of flat, so I'm just going to work my way around the wreath and fluff it up a bit. Because this is a winter wonderland wreath, I want to give mine a touch of snow. So I'm using some of my white acrylic paint, and I'm just working my way around with a paintbrush, adding a little bit here and there. The next layer of greenery that I'm adding to my wreath, I actually picked this up at Michael's. It was after Easter and I found it on the clearance rack. I think I ended up paying about $2 for it. I'm using this because I already had it on hand, but you can probably find something similar at the Dollar Tree. I used my clippers and clipped each one free from the main stem. I have 6 pieces and I'm going to evenly space 3 on the top and 3 on the bottom. I'll be adding on a bow, so I left a small area open on the left. Then, to be sure that they don't move, I hot glued them into place. The next accent I'm adding onto my wreath is 3 stems of snow greenery from the Dollar Tree. 2 are sparkly and the other resembles pine sprigs. I used my clippers and I clipped them all free from the main stem. I'm first adding on the pine greenery, and there's only 5 of them, so I'm adding 3 to the bottom and 2 onto the top. Happy with their placement, I'm now using my hot glue gun to attach them. I'm now adding on the snow greenery, and I'm pretty much trying to mimic what I'm adding on the bottom onto the top. I really liked using this type of greenery on my wreath because when it's hanging and the sun hits it, it gives just a bit of sparkle. I always like to find the placement of my greenery first because if you're not happy, you can always just pull it out and move it around. And now that everything's in place, I'm just going to hot glue it so it doesn't move. To give my wreath that winter wonderland accent, I'm adding on 3 bunches of the Dollar Tree wintry willows. And just like my other greenery, I clipped them all free from the main stem. I'm adding the snowy willows in between the other greenery and just kind of filling in the open spaces here and there. I added 2 of the willow stems on the top and the bottom center just to hide a little bit of the grapevine wreath. Now that I have them all in place, I'm using my glue gun to attach them. I'm making a bow for my wreath and I'm using some ribbon that I already had on hand. Mine is a 2.5-inch white wired ribbon, and mine has a little bit of a design. You can always use a plain white ribbon for this DIY, and I think that would look great too. I'm using 2 Dollar Tree ribbons, a 2.5-inch black and white plaid, along with a 2-inch burlap ribbon. I'll be using my bow maker, and I picked this up a while back, and you can find it on Amazon. I'm starting with the white ribbon, and I'm making 1 18-inch tail and then 4 6-inch loops. And when I'm done, I'll finish up with another 18-inch tail. When I'm done, I'm cutting both ends at an angle, and now I'm adding on my burlap ribbon. I'm once again making two 18-inch tails, but this time I'm making four 5-inch loops. These are the sizes that I chose for my bow, but you can always make your tails longer or shorter and the loops larger or smaller. And for this bow, I'm cutting all the tails at the end at an angle. When that's complete, I'm adding on my black and white plaid ribbon. And once again, I'm making the two 18-inch tails, but this time I'm making four 4-inch loops. Now that I'm done, I'm using a piece of floral wire to attach my bow together. I placed it over the center of my bow, down both sides, and then twisted it together tightly on the back. When I was done, I then fluffed out the loops. I want to finish off the center of my bow and make it look a little more complete. I used a piece of the leftover black and white plaid ribbon and made a small knot in the middle. When I was done, I made sure to cut the ends so they were long enough to wrap around my bow. I added some hot glue to the center and then placed down my knot. I wrapped the two ends around the bow and tied them together in the back. I'm adding my bow to the wreath, and the two wires that I attached it with are not long enough to go around, so I'm just wrapping them around as far as they'll go. Then all I did was add a generous amount of hot glue under the bow. For the hanging accent in the center of my wreath, I'm using two of the ice skate ornaments from the Dollar Tree. They have some white bead accents on the top, and I just decided to remove mine. The bottom of the skates are brown, and you can leave them as is, but I'm painting mine with some light gray acrylic paint. When I was done with the first coat, I let it dry, and then I did give it a second. I want to add a touch of snow to the greenery on the top of each of the skates, and just like I did the garland in the beginning, I'm using some white acrylic paint and I'm just dabbing it on. There are a couple of little pine cones up there, and I gave them an accent as well. I'm using two of the larger snowflake stickers from the Dollar Tree to accent the top of my ice skates. I placed one on the faux fur of each. I'm attaching a piece of thick jute to the top of each skate, but first I need to get their placement. I placed the skates inside of the wreath and then decided how long I wanted the jute hanger. Before I attach the jute, I'm attaching the two skates together. I added some hot glue to the fur on the front of one and then tucked the other one up next to it. With my skates attached, I flipped them over and turned them around so they're now upside down. I'm adding on some hot glue and attaching the ends of the jute onto each skate. I placed the wreath over the skates so I have them hanging in the center. Now that I know their position, I turned my wreath over and attached the jute onto the back. I'm adding on four of the white sparkly snowflakes from the Dollar Tree. I'm placing my first two on the bottom and my second two on the top. To be sure they don't move out of place, I'm using my hot glue gun to attach them. My last accent is 4 small pine cones, and I had these on hand, but you can find them at the Dollar Tree. Once in a while they have them in a bag, but most of the time they're on a pick. Just like the garland and the top of the ice skates, I'm adding on a snowy accent using my white paint. With the paint dry, just like the snowflakes, I'm adding 2 to the bottom and 2 onto the top. Happy with their placement, I then attached them permanently. I gave the ribbons a little curl, and with that, my farmhouse winter wreath is ready for my front door. To make my farmhouse Christmas wreath, I'm using one of the 14-inch wire wreath forms from the Dollar Tree. For the base of my wreath, I'm using 8 bunches of the nautical rope, and these came from the Dollar Tree as well. I'm using the larger rope. There are 2 sizes, so depending on which size you choose, you may use a little more or a little less. I'm using my ruler and cutting my rope into 6-inch pieces. When you're done, you'll have a bunch of 6-inch pieces of nautical cut rope. To attach them, I'm first sliding one piece between the middle wire and the inside wire. I make sure both ends are even. I then add some hot glue to the bottom and enough on both sides to attach the 2 pieces of rope together. I now slide my next piece on the open inside wire next to my first and on the outside. Make sure that both ends are even. And now once again, I'm adding enough hot glue on the bottom and the 2 sides to attach the 2 pieces together. I'm now adding on my 3rd piece next to my first, once again sliding it between the middle and the inside wire, making sure the ends are even and attaching them together with my glue gun. I then added on my 4th, following the same instructions as I worked my way around the form. I did place down a piece of waxed paper because some of the hot glue can drip between the pieces of the cut rope. When pinching the rope together, be aware of where the hot glue is so you don't burn your fingers, and you will have to hold the rope together until the hot glue sets up. Usually takes about 10 seconds or so. I attached 10 ropes on the outside wires and 9 on the inside. But depending on the thickness of your rope, that may vary. I continued working my way around and I finally finished up adding on my last piece. Some of the rope will fray as you're attaching it, but usually not enough, so I'm working my way around the form, unwinding the strands. I'm gently pulling each of them apart, so in the end, my wreath has a nice full appearance. When you're done, if you do find some pieces that aren't even on the outside or the inside, You can always snip them off with your scissors. You can pretty much use this wreath for any season. I'm making mine a Christmas wreath, so I'm going to be adding on some accents. I'm making a bow for my wreath, and I'm starting with some natural 4-inch burlap that came from burlapfabric.com. It's a quality burlap, and I will have the company linked below in case you'd like to check it out. Adding to it, I'm also using a 1 1/2 inch Christmas ribbon from the Dollar Tree. I'm using my bow maker that I picked up on Amazon a while back, and I'm giving myself 2 12-inch tails and 2 6-inch loops. For the Christmas ribbon, I'm giving myself 2 12-inch tails and 4 6-inch loops. There's not much ribbon left on the spool, so I'm making 2 7-inch tails and 2 3-inch loops. To attach my bow together, I'm using a piece of floral wire long enough to wrap around the wreath. I placed it over the center of the bow, pulled back tightly, and twisted it together. I then fluffed out all the loops and cut the tails at an angle. Attaching the bow to my wreath, I'm placing the 2 wires over the top and twisting them together tightly on the back. I'm adding some greenery to my wreath, and I'm using 2 of these winter picks that I had on hand. The only problem is they have blue berries on them, and I want them to be red to match the holly on my ribbon. To change them up, I grabbed some red acrylic paint and I gave each of them a coat. What a difference a little paint makes, and when it was dry, I then tucked the stems under the bow. I cut off the excess wire and then hot glued them into place. I'm adding on a little more greenery using 2 stems that I had on hand and then some rosemary from the Dollar Tree. I tucked the 2 larger stems under the greenery and hot glued them into place. I then cut the rosemary separate from the main stem and attached it to the wreath. I added some hot glue to help hold them in place, and now that I'm done, this pretty farmhouse Christmas rope wreath is ready for the holidays. Getting started, I'm using one of the 14-inch wire wreath forms from the Dollar Tree. I'll be wrapping it with 3 microfiber cloths, and at the Dollar Tree, I found these in the automotive department. I have my first piece lying flat lengthwise. I place my wreath form right side up on top of the fabric. I then pulled all of it over the top and tucked it underneath. As I was adding it, I made sure that I had enough fabric left over so that I could cover the top. When that was done, I pulled the top fabric tightly over the form and tucked the edge underneath. With everything pulled tightly against the form, I then glued down the edge. With my first piece glued in place, I then lightly scrunched it together. To add on my second piece, I just followed the same instructions as the first. Pulled the fabric over and tucked it under the form. I then pulled the fabric tightly over the top and hot glued down the edges on the bottom. Because you want to move the fabric around, this is why no hot glue will come directly in contact with the wire wreath form. With it all in place, I'm now scrunching this side of the fabric up and I'm adding on my last piece. With all three of the microfiber cloths attached to my wreath, I'm tucking under the edges on the top and the bottom, so this way you can't see where the fabric began and where it ended. To decorate my wreath, I'm starting by using 2 stems of the sparkly greenery from the Dollar Tree. I want to be able to place them down individually, so I'm cutting them free from the main stem. I always like to lay out my greenery first before I permanently attach it. So I'm basically trying to match my placement on the top with the greenery on the bottom. I'm adding a bow to my wreath, so I'm leaving an open space where I'll be attaching it. With everything in place, I'm now attaching it with my glue gun. As the floral focus on my wreath, I'm using 2 of the large white poinsettias, and these came from the Dollar Tree. They have a pretty silver accent center, and I just popped 2 of them from the main stem. I'm also using 2 smaller white poinsettias, and these came from the Dollar Tree as well. These 2 have sparkly centers, and the top petals have a lacy accent. I placed the 2 larger flowers on the inside of the wreath and the 2 smaller on the outside. Happy with their placement, I used my hot glue gun to attach them. With my flowers in place, I'm now making a bow for my wreath, and I'm using my bow maker. I picked this up a while back on Amazon. I'll be attaching my bow together using a piece of floral wire. For my first layer, I'm using this pretty 2.5-inch sparkly silver ribbon, and this came from the Dollar Tree. To start my bow, I'm making 2 12-inch tails and 4 4.5-inch loops. To make it easier to shape my bow, both of my ribbons are wired. When I was done, I then cut both of the tails at an angle. My next ribbon is 2.5 inches. It's white with silver accents. This I had on hand, but you can find similar ribbon. It's a little bit smaller in the wedding department at the Dollar Tree. Adding this ribbon, I'm once again making two 12-inch tails, but this time I'm making four 3.5-inch loops. Just like my silver ribbon, I cut both of the tails off at an angle. I placed the floral wire around the center of my bow, pulled it tightly, and then twisted it together on the back. I then fluffed out all of my loops. I have a small piece of wire left over on the back, and you can snip it off if you'd like. I'm just going to fold mine over and press it against the bow. I placed my bow between my two large flowers and then hot glued it into place. The next layer that I'm adding to the wreath are two stems of this frosted greenery from the Dollar Tree, and it has these large white berry accents that are actually little white styrofoam balls. I'm once again using my clippers and cutting each free from the main stem. I live out in the country, and every once in a while something will get into the house, and of course here's a little stink bug that showed up on my glue gun wire. It surprised me at first, but I just caught him. I never kill anything, and I let it outside. Back to the wreath, I'm adding on my greenery with the berries. I'm pretty much trying to mimic what I place on the bottom onto the top. To give myself some greenery behind the bow, I'm placing two of the sprigs there. To make sure that nothing falls from the wreath, I then hot glued them all in place. While I was at the Dollar Tree picking up my wreath supplies, to add on another layer of color and texture, I picked up two stems of this snow greenery. This time I tucked it in between the other greenery, just trying to hide those open spaces. While making this wreath, these are the colors and the greenery that I chose, but Dollar Tree has a ton of different options, so you can always change it up. As my final accent, to pull that sparkly silver from the center of the poinsettias, I'm using a silver branch from the Dollar Tree, and I'm snipping it into individual pieces. I ended up with a pretty big handful, and so now I'm just tucking them randomly in the wreath. Here and there, I don't have any set plan. And as I'm doing it, if I don't like where I've tucked it in, I just pull it out and put it in a different place. Now that I have them all in place, this was probably the hardest part of making this wreath. I had to make sure with my glue gun that I went in and gave each one of them a little dot of hot glue. Now that I'm done, my pretty white Christmas wreath is complete. And although I'm somebody that usually likes a lot of color, I do like the simplicity, and this will surely complement anyone's winter or Christmas home decor. Well, here we are at the end of the video, and I really hope you had fun making these winter and Christmas wreath DIYs with me. If you're looking for more holiday home decor ideas, I will leave some playlists at the end of this video as well as in my description. And if you're new to my channel and you think, hey, I'd like to come back and hang out with her again, don't forget to click that little red subscribe button below. I hope you all have a safe, healthy, and magical day, and until next time, bye everybody!